Nobody had told the boy to sit so still. He had learned it himself, the way children learn things that keep them out of trouble, and he was practicing it now on the depot bench outside Caldwell, Kansas, on an October afternoon with the wind coming off the flats and nobody for company, and 3 hours already behind him and no way of knowing how many more ahead. He was 8 years old. His name was Ellis. His hands were folded in his lap and his eyes were on the road south, and to anyone passing he looked like a child who was simply waiting, which was true, and no more than that. There was a word that followed him. It had been written on a paper tag and pinned to his coat when they put him on the Dodge City stage in April. And though he had torn the tag off 2 weeks after arriving at the Quarter W Ranch, after a hired hand read it aloud at the supper table and the other men laughed, the word itself had not gone anywhere. It lived in the way people introduced him, and in the letters the county welfare agent wrote to Harlan Briggs, and in the careful voice the welfare agent used whenever he visited, as though careful was the same as kind. Ruined, one word. Enough, apparently, for a boy whose father had borrowed money he could not pay and been hanged for what he did next. Enough to pin to a child's coat as a full description. Ellis was still thinking about this, which was a mistake, because thinking about it never improved anything when the woman came around the corner of the freight building. She had a dark braid and a canvas work coat with the collar turned up and a pair of saddlebags over one shoulder and mud on both boots up to the ankle. She moved like someone who had been moving all day and intended to keep going. She stopped when she saw the bench. She looked at the depot window, dark and closed. She looked at Ellis. He was, it occurred to him, the only person on the platform. The only person, in fact, on this entire side of the building. "Mind if I wait with you?" she said. He moved over 6 inches to make room. Her name was Nora Vass. She had missed her connection to Pratt by 4 hours because the stage from Larned threw a wheel outside of Kinsley, and they had spent the better part of the afternoon jacking it up in a dry creek bed. She told him this without being asked, the way adults sometimes talk to children they were not trying to manage. She set her saddlebags on the ground and sat with her elbows on her knees and looked at the road south, the same direction he was looking. "You waiting on the southbound?" "No, ma'am. Waiting on a man from a ranch." "Which ranch?" "Quarter W. Briggs outfit, south of the river." She turned her head. The look on her face was brief and unreadable. She pulled her hat brim down. "Harlan?" "Yes, ma'am." She turned back to the road. She did not say anything further about Harlan Briggs, which the boy had learned was what people did when they knew something they were choosing not to say in front of a child. The wind pushed a tin can across the depot yard, and it caught on a fence post and rattled there. She reached into her coat pocket and produced 2 hard biscuits wrapped in cloth and held one out to him without looking. He took it because he had been sitting there since before noon and had not eaten, and because she offered it the way you offered something you had extra of, with no charity in the motion at all. He ate the biscuit. She ate hers. They watched the road. "What's your name?" she said. "Ellis." "Ellis what?" He paused 1 beat. "Briggs." It was not true, and both of them knew it, because a boy with Briggs' name would not have been sitting alone on a depot bench with a paper tag pinned to his coat 6 months ago. She did not correct him, and he was grateful for that in a way he could not have said into words. Harlan Briggs came around the corner of the dry goods store 40 minutes later. He stopped when he saw Nora Vass. She had stood to stretch her legs and was leaning against the hitching post with her arms crossed, and he stopped with his hand on the wagon gate and took in the whole picture. He set his hand on the wagon gate. Nora Vass. It was the way Briggs greeted most things he had not planned for. "Harlan," she pulled her hat brim down against the wind. "I missed my connection. I'll hire a horse if you've got one to spare and find my own way to Pratt in the morning." Briggs said something under his breath that Ellis did not catch. He looked at the boy, then at the woman, then at the horizon, in the manner of a man figuring what something was going to cost him. The Dunbar place is empty. He turned back to Nora. You know horses. I do. My man Kettner left in August. I'm behind on the remuda work going into winter. The boy watched Nora Vass hold Briggs's gaze for a long moment. He watched Briggs look at the ground. He had seen this before, the look adults gave each other when one owed the other something they had not paid and were not going to say so in front of a witness. Wages, not a question. 30 a month. 35. Briggs got in the wagon and picked up the reins. Get in if you're coming. Ellis had learned that was as close to yes as Briggs got on any subject. The Dunbar place sat 40 yards from the main barn, 3 rooms, a root cellar that it held, a stove that drew clean, and a pump that worked until the 3rd week of November, when the freeze came down from the north in a single night and stopped it cold. Nora discovered it at dawn when she went out to water the horses before the morning feed. Ellis was already at the barn when she came in through the side door, his breath showing white, a measuring bucket in each hand, moving along the stall line the way he had been doing since August when Kettner left and Briggs told him to make himself useful if he wanted to stay. Nora stood in the barn doorway. She came to the stall line. Pumps out. Frozen through. Has been since before first light. He set one bucket down and picked up the iron bar kept beside the trough for that purpose. 3rd post to the left is the weakest spot. Ice goes thinnest there overnight. She crossed to him and took the bar from his hands and weighed it. Then she handed it back. Show me. He showed her the creek crossing, the weak post, the angle to come at the ice without shattering the trough lip. She watched him work it twice, and then she did it herself, twice more, until she had the motion. She did not make a lesson of it in either direction. The pump stayed frozen for 9 days. Those 9 days she carried water from the creek to the barn, to the house, and to the bunkhouse alongside her regular work with the remuda, which was 14 horses in various conditions after a summer without a proper horseman. 2 of them she did not trust. At the end of the 1st week she found Briggs at the corral fence and told him plainly, these 2 need to go to a lighter operation. They'll hurt somebody before spring. Briggs told her to use her judgment. He said it in the tone of a man who would hold the opposite opinion if anything went wrong. She used her judgment. She did not fight the difficult horses. She stood at the fence with her weight easy and her hands loose and let them come to her when they wanted to, and she knew when a horse was sore-footed against the cold versus sour-tempered versus simply green and poorly handled, and she treated each thing for what it was. The roan mare with the swollen near hock needed poulticing, not rest. Nora mixed the salt to water at the ratio that drew heat without pulling too much moisture from the skin, and she changed the poultice twice each day for 5 days, and the mare came sound. Ellis came to the fence every morning and watched. He asked questions only when he could not work out the answer by watching. On the 6th day she handed him a lead rope and showed him how to stand, weight back, rope held loose, eyes soft. On the 7th day, he stood that way with a young bay gelding who had not been properly handled since spring, and the gelding dropped its head and breathed out slow. Nora kept her eyes on the horse. You've got quiet hands. He did not say thank you. He was not sure what to say. He had not been told he was good at anything before that. He went back to the house that night and set the supper table for 3. He had been doing it for 4 days, putting out the 3rd plate and cup at the place where she would sit if she came in from the barn and joined them for supper. Briggs had not said she ought to eat at the main house. He had also not said she should not. Ellis had decided to interpret the silence as permission, which was a system of reasoning that had served him adequately since April. Briggs came in, took in the table, and sat down without a word. He ate in the manner he always ate, efficiently, and with attention to what was in front of him and nothing else. After supper, he pushed back his chair and looked at the third place for a moment, the cup and the unused plate, and then he pushed it in and went to the door. Ellis watched him go. In the morning, the third place was still there, where Ellis had left it, and Briggs sat down and ate and said nothing about it then either. The cup was where Ellis had put it. The plate was where Ellis had put it. That was enough. The county welfare agent arrived on the 22nd of November, a Tuesday, in a buggy with a lacquered top and a horse that showed it had never worked a hard season. Mr. Crail was a narrow man in a good coat, and he had papers in a leather case, and he read from them at the kitchen table in a careful voice, as though the words themselves needed handling. The boy's maternal aunt, a Mrs. Edna Calhoun of Wichita, had applied for and been granted preliminary custody approval. She was a widow of modest means but good standing. She kept a clean house. She had 2 spare rooms. The placement was not punitive, Crail was careful to say. There was no finding of neglect against the quarter W. It was simply that a widow of good standing with 2 rooms was, in the eyes of the county, a more suitable arrangement for a boy of Ellis's particular history than a working cattle operation with no woman of the household. No woman of the household. Briggs sat across from him with his hands flat on the table and his jaw set. Nora was not at the kitchen table. She had not been invited to the kitchen table. She was in the barn. Ellis knew because he had looked out the window twice since Crail arrived, and the yellow square of the lantern burned through the high barn window, steady and not moving. Crail left without a final determination. He would return in 3 weeks. A resolution before the new year would be in the boy's best interest. He said good day to Briggs and good day to the empty room around him and went out to his buggy. Ellis listened to the wheels on the frozen ruts until he could not hear them. Briggs had not moved from the table. The boy got up and went to the barn. Nora was poulticing the roan mare again, which did not need poulticing any more, but which had the look of a task that needed doing. Her back was to the door when Ellis came in. "How many weeks did he give?" she said, before he had spoken. 3. She worked the cloth around the mare's hock. The mare stood patient. She sat back on her heels. The aunt. Is she kind? Ellis considered this the way he considered most things, which was to take it seriously, because being careless with a question was the same as being careless with a tool and produced the same kind of damage. I don't know her well. I met her once. She smelled like lavender water, and she cried a great deal at the funeral. I do not think she cried about my father. Nora sat back on her heels. She stripped the work gloves from her hands. Briggs ought to have said something to him. It was the only time in 3 weeks Ellis had heard her speak against anyone in the household, and the way she said it was not anger. It was something nearer to weariness. He doesn't say much. No, he doesn't. She stripped the work gloves from her hands. She crossed to the barn door and stood with one hand on the frame, looking out at the house, the lamp burning in the kitchen window behind the frost on the glass. The cold that came through was the kind that found the gap between your collar and your neck and settled there. She stayed longer than was necessary, and Ellis understood she was not looking at the house but at what Crail had said and what Briggs had failed to say in response to it, and she was deciding something about both. Go to bed, Ellis. It's cold out here. He moved toward the door and stopped. He turned back. You're not going to leave. He had said it as a fact, the way you stated a thing you needed to be true and were checking by saying it aloud to hear whether it held. She looked at him across the length of the barn. Go to bed. Not a no. He went. The table was set for 3 at breakfast the next morning, and the morning after, and the morning after that. Ellis set it before Briggs was up. He put out the blue cup at her place, the one that was heavier and held heat longer. He put it at the end of the table across from Briggs and to his left, where she had been sitting since the first time she came in from the barn, and found it there and sat down without a word, because that was the kind of fact she would recognize as settled. On the 4th morning, Briggs came down and stood at the table and studied the 3 places, and then turned to the window and studied the barn lantern burning steady in the dark, which meant she was already at morning feed. He sat down. On the 6th morning, she came in from the barn before Briggs was up and found Ellis alone at the table with his hands around his water cup. She stopped in the doorway. She looked at the 3 places set. She sat down. They did not speak for several minutes. The wind had found the corners of the house and was working at them. "Does he know you do this?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "What does he say?" "Nothing." She turned her cup in her hands. "Ellis, ma'am, when Crail comes back in 3 weeks." "I know." They sat in the quiet that had been between them since the depot bench in October, the kind that was not empty but full, where 2 people understood each other well enough that the words they were not saying were present in the room as clearly as the words they had said. Outside, a horse moved in the barn, and the stall door rattled once and went still. The morning Crail came back, it was the 14th of December, and cold enough that the pump had seized again overnight. Ellis had been breaking ice at the creek trough since before light. He heard the buggy on the road, and he came back to the barn with the iron bar still in his hand. Briggs came out of the house and shook Crail's hand on the porch. Nora was at the far end of the barn, re-nailing a loose shoeboard on the roan mare's stall. She had a hammer and drove 3 nails in succession, clean and flush, the way she did all tasks that required precision. Ellis set the iron bar against the wall. He went to the tack room. The previous horseman had kept a stick of chalk for marking the feedboard, white and fat, the kind that wrote thick. Ellis took it and came back through the barn. He stepped past the stall line to the front, where the barn entrance faced the porch. There was a school slate hanging on a nail beside the main door. Kettner had used it for leaving notes about which horses needed the farrier and which needed feed changes. It had been blank since August. Ellis had kept it blank even when it would have been useful to write on it, for a reason he had not looked at directly until this morning. He wrote in his best hand, careful with each letter, "Nora Vass works here." He carried the slate outside and hung it back on its nail where the porch had a clear line to it. Then he stepped back inside. Nora had come up to the front of the barn. She was standing 6 feet from him with the hammer at her side and an expression he could not fully name, though it was not anger. He turned back to Nora. She should know who's here. He meant Crail. He meant the county. He meant anyone who came to this place and told Briggs there was no woman of the household. "You're here. You were here, before me, even. You were here in the town, at the depot." Nora did not say anything right away. Her jaw was tight in the way of a person making a determination. She said his name. "Ellis, you asked me if the aunt was kind." He looked at the frozen ground between them. "She cried at the funeral, and she has 2 rooms. That is all I know about her. That is all I know about kind." He lifted his eyes. "I know about here. I know this barn and this table and this cold and who's at it and who carries the water when the pump quits. That's what I know." Nora Vass set the hammer on the top rail of the nearest stall. She crossed the 6 feet between them and put her hand on his shoulder. Not brisk, not instructional, the kind of touch that simply acknowledged that a person was standing there and had said a true thing and deserved to have it received. She held it there a moment without speaking. He did not move. Briggs brought Crail to the barn himself. He had simply turned from the porch and walked toward it, with Crail following, and they came through the main door and found Ellis standing in the barn, and Nora with her hand still on his shoulder. Crail had walked past the slate on the way in. He paused now, glancing back at it through the open door. Briggs did not check the slate. He looked at Nora. He looked at Ellis and the way the boy was standing, planted and settled, the way a person stood who had made up their mind about something. Briggs turned to Crail. She runs the remuda. Has done since October. I see that. Crail adjusted his leather case, but the question of the household arrangement, Mr. Briggs, as I noted in my previous visit, she lives on the property. The Dunbar house. That is separate accommodation, not, I know what it is. Briggs put his eyes on the straw at his feet. He was a man who did his calculations where no one could see them being done, and when he arrived at a figure, he did not second-guess it. He turned to Nora. Come to the house tonight. Harlan, her voice was level. Bring what you need from the Dunbar place. Bring all of it. Crail cleared his throat. Mr. Briggs, for the purposes of county evaluation, the living arrangement as currently constituted does not satisfy. What would satisfy it? Crail found his footing carefully. A permanent arrangement, documented or witnessed, would address the county's concern regarding a minor in the care of an unmarried household. Something on paper, signed, in the presence of. There's paper in the house. Briggs held Crail's gaze a moment. Come inside. He wrote her name at the kitchen table that night, under the lamplight, with Ellis on one side of him and Nora on the other, and Crail across from all three of them, with his case open and his own pen already out. The document was the brand registration for the quarter W, which listed the registered owner of the mark and the land parcel it operated on, and there was a line at the bottom where a second party could be added if the operation changed hands or was jointly held. Briggs had never used that line. He had put papers in front of other people to sign for 6 years and had never thought about that particular line at all until about 40 minutes ago, standing in his own barn with his hands in his pockets. He was not a man who made speeches. He had written a dead wife's name on paper 6 years before and had not written a woman's name on any document since, and that was as much as anyone needed to know about what it cost him to reach for the pen. He uncapped it and set the cap on the table deliberately and held the pen over the line for 2 breaths. Crail did not rush him. Nora did not rush him. Ellis did not rush him. The lamp on the table burned steady and threw their 4 shadows up the wall behind them. And outside, the December wind was working at the eaves, and the house was very quiet. He wrote Nora Vass Briggs in a hand that shook very slightly on the final name and then went steady. He set the pen down. He did not look up. Nora looked at the paper for a long time. She studied the name at the bottom the way you studied a thing you had not expected to be given and did not yet know how to carry. Then she put her thumb beside it, not touching the ink, just close to it, as though confirming it was real. Then Ellis got up from his chair and went to the shelf and took down a 4th cup. January came in hard and stayed hard, and the quarter W settled into the kind of quiet a working place earns when the people in it know their roles and trust each other inside those roles. By February, Nora had taken over the ranch accounts, not because anyone asked her to, but because Briggs set the ledger book on the kitchen table beside her coffee one morning and went back to the barn, and she opened it and spent 3 evenings making it right. He never asked what she had found in it. She never told him. The roan mare came fully sound by the first thaw. Ellis learned to bring in any horse on the remuda by March, even the 2 difficult ones that Nora had almost sent away in November, and ultimately decided to keep and school slowly through the winter. By spring he could do it without the lead rope on the easy ones, which was something none of the hired men could do. She noticed, when it happened. She was at the outside fence one evening in the last of the light, leaning on the top rail with her arms crossed, when he came out of the barn toward the paddock with no rope and no bucket, and the young bay gelding, the one that had been the most difficult all winter, lifted its head and turned at the sound of his footsteps and walked to him across the whole length of the field on its own, unhurried, as though it had decided on him. She said nothing. He said nothing. They walked the horse back to the barn together in the last of the evening light, her on one side and the boy on the other, the gelding moving easy between them, their breath showing white in the cold that still lived in the air even in March in Kansas, and the barn door open ahead of them with the lamp burning inside, and the smell of hay and horses, and the particular warm dark of a place that had been looked after. On the shelf beside the barn door, the chalk slate hung on its nail. Nora Vass works here. Nobody had taken it down. Nobody had changed it. It had become the kind of fact that a place absorbs the way a worn threshold absorbs the shape of the boots that cross it, the way a table absorbs the history of the meals laid out on it, quietly and by degree until it is simply part of the thing. The letters were firm in the morning and firm at the evening feed, in the dry weeks and the wet ones, and they were there the spring Ellis turned 9 and the spring he turned 10. He had written her there. She had stayed. In April, when the ground was soft enough to work, Briggs had the brand iron recut with both initials in it, which was a practical matter and cost him a day's work with the smithy in town, and which he mentioned to no one as anything other than a routine expense. Nobody at the Quarter W mentioned it as anything other than that either.